Good morning from Paris and Oxford, and good afternoon for Tokyo. We would like to start today's Creative Brown Bag Lunch Seminar. My name is Aki Tamura, Senior Advisor at Rieti and the Director General at JITRO Paris. I will be serving as a moderator and commentator for this seminar. Today, we are truly honored to welcome a good friend of mine, Professor Yelin Tang, Professor of Public Policy at the University of Oxford. I always, difficult for me to always pronounce this name, the Blavatsky School of Government, and non-resident senior fellow at the Peterson Institute for International Economics. Today, Yelin will deliver a lecture titled China's Economic Security Growth Model, Implication for the US-China Security Dilemma and Lesson for Other Major Players, I believe including Japan. After Yelin's presentation, I will provide my brief comments and question. Then the floor will be open to the audience for questions until 5 p.m. in Tokyo time. As for her background and academic achievement, the audience will be able to find them in her bio. But hereby, I would like to mention just one thing. Her name is actually quoted in the recent Nikkei newspaper Keizai Kyoushitsu on January 6 this year, written by Professor Henry Farrell. I can show the clump, the Keizai Kyoushitsu clump. Her name is referred here. The Henry and the Yelin worked together on how the U.S. shocks, the so-called knowledge shocks, particularly I believe the twice Snowden shock in 2013 and restriction by the U.S. government against the DZE in 2018. These two times, the U.S. shock impacted on China's change of balance in the trade-off between the innovation gain and the security risk, and including the kind of even the China, the reshuffled, the reorganized even institutional system, within the party and the government. Their academic work is carried in the journal International Study, journal so-called International Studies Quarterly, the 69, that was publicized in 2025, last year, titled Driven to Self-Reliance. If you're interested in her work, I would suggest you have a read the work directly. Some of the content in that article will be used, I believe, for her today's presentation. Having made my introductory remark, I would like to give a floor to Yelin. Yelin, you have the floor.
Thank you very much. And please let me start off by thanking Aki-san and Rieti for the very kind invitation to share my ongoing research with all of you today. I will speak for about 40 minutes. I'll try to keep to time, but I'm really looking forward to the comments, questions from the audience, and to have a substantive and rich discussion on this very important topic. So let me start with sharing my slides, and hopefully everyone can see this fine. So by way of structuring today's discussion, this is the sequence of how I would like to move forward. I will start out by laying out what I see as the major components of the economic security growth model that I argue that China is operating on today. Having laid that out descriptively, I then want to go analytically into identifying a few of the important distortions that would occur when a country moves into an economic security growth model logic, when security logic rather than economic logic is the primary driver of economic policy. And then I'll want to link this now to relationships between the US and China and argue for why these potential distortions make it more likely that a security dilemma between the US and China will persist into the foreseeable future, and then conclude by discussing what this overall geopolitical and geoeconomic landscape means for other major players, including Japan. So that's the overview roadmap moving forward. So let me start with the beginning, right? So when we think about China's growth model, the reason I say it's an economic security growth model is that I no longer believe that it is appropriate to describe China's growth model in the traditional terms of export-led or domestic investment-led or savings-led and so on. The reason I say this is that when we look at the important official policy documents coming from China, we see a very important change, right, in the guiding political slogan, in economic guiding documents such as the 5-year plans. And this political slogan is to coordinate between development and security, which effectively raises national security to the same plank as economic development and makes the two interconnected. What this means substantively is not laid out very clearly, but from my analytical standpoint, I think there are three major components, both policy and legislative. Firstly, an emphasis on dual circulation for China's trading relationships, not just to diversify away from the US, but also to shift towards having its domestic market as the main driver of growth. Secondly, when it comes to that domestic economy, to again structurally shift away from property and debt-driven infrastructure development, infrastructure investment, towards a self-reliant, innovation-driven economy to ensure against geopolitical risk. And thirdly, to build out what I think is a fairly new legal and regulatory regime to allow China to engage in economic counter-coercion, such that the government can respond forcefully to what it perceives as acts of violation of a very broad set of national interests, from sovereignty to national security and its own economic and social development. So let me quickly lay out these three components, what I mean by them. What the three components add up to is that they're all being shaped by an overarching concern of US-led containment, right? This is the term that is used by China, right? Containment, suppression, and so on. It has become a very important lens that shapes economic policy. So let's turn to dual circulation. And I want to highlight that there are some elements to the form of dual circulation that we might argue is not new, right? It is not new for China to have a slightly conflicted relationship with globalization in the sense of how much to rely on external markets, how much to rely on external demand versus domestic demand. If we look over the past few decades of Chinese economic policy since reform and opening, it's not new, right? So one might argue this might be just a doctrinal formalization of longstanding concerns. What is new? I think there is a new element in that when we see China now shifting towards domestic demand and less and a little bit away from external demand, the perceived threat is different. Whereas in previous decades, a perceived threat might be just the vagaries and unpredictability of external markets. Now the threat is coming from the vagaries and unpredictable actions of foreign governments. So this is why I argue there's more of a security logic that's driving the current shift to dual circulation. Is it working? Yes and no, right? Yes, in the sense that on a very superficial basis, we see from trade statistics that direct trade between the US and China is decreasing. A lot of that has been driven by US tariffs itself. So you can see this here, right? This divergence between direct trade between the US and China and other advanced economies and the rest of the world. The rest of the world is going up. With the US, it's plateauing. But of course, that masks what is actually happening with supply chains. There is a lot of indirect trade through connector countries, right? And the US is obviously aware of this and perhaps wants to take more serious action about this. We'll come back to this angle at the end. But there are many aspects of dual circulation that to me are not working, right? In spite of official rhetoric kind of emphasizing the need for domestic demand to be the main driver of growth, this is proving quite hard to achieve, right? There's chronically weak consumer confidence that has been in the negative parts of the index for many quarters now. Household borrowing, because of the property collapse, right? The reduced wealth, the wealth effect, the negative wealth impact on households is putting downward pressure on borrowing and expectations for the future. The deflation of the producer price index went on for almost 44 months. Only now is reaching the zero or hopefully maybe slightly positive territory, and that's driving a lot of excess capacity in China's domestic economy, which of course then means that these excess production has to search for markets elsewhere. And the export surge, exports being the main bright spot of the Chinese economy at the moment, is translating into trade frictions, right? In spite of the efforts to diversify away from the US and build stronger relations with other economies, there is a backlash. And you can see this from the statistics here I'm showing you today, the spike in investigations against China. Many of these investigations are coming from other parts of the world, right? In Turkey and Brazil and India and so on. So the shift towards dual circulation, I would argue, is quite difficult, in spite of official efforts to do so. We see China trying to address this through its anti-involution campaign. Let me turn now to the second component, right? Self-reliant innovation. Again, is this new? One might argue, well, it's not new because China has, since the Maoist period, always made the advancement of its technological capabilities a very important national priority. There is something new to this, however, I would argue, in terms of the security logic that drives innovation and self-reliant innovation today. And we can see this through the change of China's comprehensive national security concept. When this was made into law in 2015, right, the official formulation had very little mention of technology, right? If you look at the official formulation that defines the comprehensive national security concept, it discusses military, cultural, societal security. There is a slight and subtle shift from 2018 onwards, right, where we start to see more frequently the formulation include technology as part of the comprehensive national security concept. It might be easier for me to just show this figure here, right, which is a very simple calculation looking at the published articles of People's Daily. How many of these articles use the old formulation to discuss the national security concept, and how many articles use the new formulation to discuss the national security concept? And we can see very clearly there's a change from 2018 onwards to include technology, right? Elevating technology into the official national security concept. And so this tells us that there is a political and security emphasis, right, to innovation now that is different from previous periods, right? And this is accompanied by institutional restructuring as well. In 2023, there was a central committee, Science and Technology Commission, set up, which signals to the whole system that the political guidance over innovation will be strengthened moving forward. And what was previously quite a fragmented innovation landscape, right? The political guidance will try to consolidate this pre-existing innovation. And this links back to the article that was mentioned in the introduction with Henry Farrell and Abe Newman and Mark Dallas on China's drive for self-reliance. Let me elaborate a little bit more about that drive with this figure here, which again highlights a new security element to China's quest for innovation, right? And that there's a shift away from looking at globalization primarily as a source of opportunity and much more towards looking at innovation as a source of vulnerability. So this figure here, what you see is the analysis of about 488,000 newspaper articles published in the Chinese ecosystem. And what we did in this analysis is to just look at the prevalence of two types of discourse. The first type of discourse is language that is supportive of external liberalization and international cooperation. That's the red dashed line that you see on the figure. And language and discourse that is concerned with decoupling. That is the black solid line that you see on the figure here. And you can see that there is a consistent preference for external liberalization rather than decoupling over a very, almost a decade and a half of the analysis that I'm showing here. Again, from 2018 onwards, you start to see a shift, right? It's no longer a stable trend. The language supportive of international cooperation, external liberalization plateaus. It plummets a bit during COVID. And then language supportive of or concerned with decoupling starts spiking up. And in 2021, which is let me just lay out the description here on the left-hand side, right? In 2021, with the release of the 14th five-year plan, you see a spike in language concerned with decoupling and self-reliance. And for the first time, that language exceeds language that's more interested in international cooperation and external liberalization. So this is the second external knowledge shock that my co-authors and I discuss in our article in International Studies Quarterly, showing there is something new going on here, and there's a shift away from views about how globalization feeds into China's innovation landscape and the importance now of self-reliance and decoupling. So it's not just rhetorical, it's not just institutional. We see changes in expenditure as well. So here, this is just a very simple figure showing the consistent increase in central government expenditure for science and technology here, if you can see my mouse, which exceeds consistent increases in other parts of the system in defense, in education, and so on. So again, money is being put towards this policy emphasis. In addition, changes are taking place in the education system. So if you look at the numbers of new majors being approved by the Ministry of Education, in 2020, about 50% of the new majors that were approved by the Ministry of Education belonged to either science or engineering. This proportion by 2024 has increased to almost 3/4. So 3/4 of the new majors approved by the Ministry of Education belong to either science or engineering. So the whole system is shifting. And let me now quickly lay out the third component of this economic security growth model, the legal regime, right? So again, what's new, what's not new, right? In some sense, there are many elements that are not new, in that we have seen in the past that China does politicize its trade relationships whenever foreign policy disputes occur, right? Whenever it's perceived, when its red lines are perceived to have been crossed. What is new is the legal backing for this kind of counter coercion being fleshed out, not on the import side, but on the export side. And I'll elaborate on this a bit more. Of course, Japan is no stranger to this, but if we look at the overall trend, right, the older model was to look at, was far more focused on import restrictions, like Norwegian salmon, Australian wine, French Bordeaux, and so on, right? Now there's much more of a legal regulatory regime around exports. And the framing as well is new, right? And there is a mobilization effort underway. And you can see this mobilization effort from the use of this term struggle that's showing up in the party theory and party guidance. So in party theory, right, we can see in 求是, right, an important party theory journal, Xi Jinping just explaining this in greater detail, right? The need to utilize legal means in, quote, international struggles, right? To use laws and regulations against what China calls sanctions, interference, and, quote, so-called long-arm jurisdiction, right? And the official recommendations laid out last year in the fourth plenum for the 15th five-year plan, we see this term struggle being used again, right? To strengthen the struggle against sanctions, interference, and long-arm jurisdiction, right? So a mobilization effort around the use of the rule of law. And we see this in legislative documents as well. So in the revision of the foreign trade law that was approved last year, right, if you look at the explanation of what was changed in the foreign trade law, right, there's a discussion on the need to enrich and improve, quote, the legal toolbox for foreign struggles. So what does this legal toolbox look like? This is a non-exhaustive list of the new legislation, both laws and supporting state council regulations that flesh out this new legal toolbox, right? And it goes from the foreign relations law, sanctions law, and trade law to the export control law and the tariff law. All of these were either revised or newly promulgated in the past 5 years. And the list keeps on growing, right? Just earlier this year, there were new regulations on industrial and supply chain security. And so this shows us a new posture coming from China that I think rounds out the economic security growth model that I'm trying to piece together here in a descriptive sense. So having laid it out descriptively, let me turn now to the potential distortions that might occur. So there are many distortionary forces in China's domestic political economy that has been laid out in very rich existing literature. What I want to do is highlight some of the new distortions that might emerge with the security logic that increasingly has an impact on economic policies. And the first distortion is what I think of as a regulatory imbalance, right? If we think about not just resource allocation, but regulatory allocation, that toolkit that I laid out in previous slides is very intently focused on the need for China to demonstrate that it can pose a credible threat to what it perceives as US-led containment and suppression, right? You see this in the phrase that the foreign ministry uses quite frequently, which is that China does not want to fight, but China is not afraid to fight, right? So this emphasis on demonstrating that China is not afraid to fight and it can bring the fight. And there's an imbalance here in that there are far fewer laws and regulations that have been focused on supporting economic liberalization as opposed to economic securitization. And then it becomes very difficult to balance the credible threat with a credible assurance. So there's a regulatory imbalance here. It's not for the lack of trying, right? Even in the midst of the Liberation Day tariffs back and forth around this time last year, we saw the Ministry of Commerce trying to issue assurances, right? So even as it issued counter tariffs and listings on its unreliable entity list, on its export control list, and so on, the Ministry of Commerce tried to balance that by saying the Chinese government continues to welcome enterprises from all countries to invest and do business in China. The question is whether or not this is at the same level of credibility with the threats coming from its counter-coercion toolkit. If you just look at foreign investment statistics, you see very little response coming from foreign investors, and that foreign investment and inflows continue to be quite depressed in the current period. So there's a regulatory imbalance there. Secondly, there's a risk aversion that I think also creates an important distortion, right? Once we bring in national security into the calculus, it becomes very difficult for firms and, I would argue, economic government agencies to engage in the old way of using cost-benefit analysis or using constraint maximization as the primary lens through which to make decisions. And that is because national security risks are very difficult to calculate in a traditional cost-benefit analysis framework. And so what we see firms doing is to pivot towards risk aversion, right? And there's some growing research that underscores the risk aversion as the primary driver of firm behavior, foreign firm behavior in China. This means that it's much harder for firms to hire as well and to get to convince staff from outside of China to work in their China offices. And it shows up, this risk aversion and fear shows up very clearly in surveys. Here, it's just the European Chamber of Commerce Business Confidence Survey that I'm showing you here. It's hard to read the text, but what I have boxed in red are geopolitical fears. And you see geopolitical fears showing up again and again in the European Chamber of Commerce's survey of its firms that are located in China, right? So, and this affects economic policy and economic outcomes in China as well. Thirdly, there is resource misallocation. So there's a lot of resource misallocation that happens in China's existing political economy. When we introduce a security logic, right, I think it supercharges the drive for resource misallocation. Again, this comes back to this weakening of traditional cost-benefit analysis once we bring national security into the calculus, right? Most governments do not put a very binding budget constraint or binding cost constraint on national security, and China is no exception here. With the weakening of that, with the new national security imperative on self-reliant innovation, right? What we will see is a supercharging of the tendency towards excess capacity in these high-tech innovation spaces. We already see this happening, right, in terms of the utilization of data centers that are being built across China. The utilization rates are currently very low. The National Development and Reform Commission has already signaled some alarm that is excess capacity in humanoid robots. And there's an old story that I think will play out again and again, which is the search for overseas demand, but this time in the high-tech innovation space. So having laid out these potential distortions, let me move on to the third component of my presentation today, which is how this feeds into a security dilemma between the US and China. So here I'm just drawing from very traditional international security literature. So what do we mean by a security dilemma? We mean that there are two states who do not want to engage in military conflict. Nevertheless, the actions of state A, when it's received by state B, is misperceived as offensive, even though state A means it as defensive, right? So misperception of intent is one channel through which state B finds it necessary to respond with escalation. And the escalatory measures, again, are meant as defensive, but are misperceived by state A as offensive, which drives state A to think it necessarily needs to escalate. And this is the spiral model in international security literature. It can also occur not through misperception, but through uncertainty about intent. So what is the intent of state A? Is it hostile? Or is it just mainly security seeking? What is the intent of state B? When there's uncertainty around intent, it can, in a rational way, drive both states to escalate, counter-escalate. And the dilemma here is that both states enter a situation of a higher likelihood of conflict, even though the beginning standpoint of both states is that they would prefer not to enter into conflict. So this is traditional international security literature. What does that mean when we think about economic security, right? If we have economic policies that are now the primary way of mediating great power relations, what happens to the traditional international security? The way I look at it is that it worsens the likelihood of a security dilemma emerging. The reason I say this is that it's hard enough for military actions to be accurately signaled as either offensive or defensive. If we are using economic policies, right, to drive national security, the signaling becomes even more ambiguous. If we think about industrial policy, for example, right, a state might be engaging in industrial policy from a defensive way to boost its own domestic resilience, but it can be perceived by other states as offensive, as an effort to dominate global markets. If we think about stockpiling, right, isn't this primarily a defensive measure, again, to boost domestic resilience? Well, if the stockpiling ends up changing substantially global prices, right, it imposes harm on other countries that can be seen as offensive. If other countries perceive the stockpiling as a preparation for war, right, it can be perceived or misperceived as offensive. Investment screening, right, isn't it primarily defensive? Well, if it's perceived by the other state as a deliberate effort to deprive its strategic firms of important pools of capital, it can be seen as imposing economic harm and can be perceived or misperceived as offensive. So this ambiguity only raises the likelihood of misperception occurring. If we think about signaling as well, right, the military sphere is much more hierarchical. There's a chain of command. When we look at the economic bureaucracy and the structure of economic bureaucracies, especially in China, it is far more complex. There are far fewer clear coordination mechanisms, even within the central government, right? So that makes it harder to accurately identify the intent coming out from the Chinese government, right? Because there are so many different central ministries, state-owned enterprises, and local governments involved. So the signaling is a lot less clear, which again raises the likelihood of uncertainty and misperception. And then when we look at the economic realm, it's not just governments, right? There are hundreds and thousands of firms, private entrepreneurs, state-owned enterprises, that are all involved in the execution of a normal market economy or a mixed market economy. So when a foreign partner looks at outcomes coming from China, what is it the result of? Is it the result of a cleanly executed policy intent? Or is it a result of poor implementation by the bureaucracy? Or is it the result of profit maximizing firms trying to make the best of a new situation? We don't know. It is a combination of all of these, right? That again makes it much harder to accurately respond, right, for the foreign state and foreign partner. And so the overarching point I'm trying to make here is that when we're using economic policies to address national security concerns, there's a greater likelihood of misperception, a greater likelihood of uncertainty, which raises the risks of the security dilemma persisting. Let me just give you a few examples, right? So the three distortions that I raised earlier, this focus on export controls and the regulatory toolkit, that regulatory imbalance reduces the likelihood of credible assurances. If we look last year in April, between April and October, this escalation between the US and China in the wake of the Liberation Day tariffs, there was a lot of uncertainty over why the licensing for rare earths were delayed by China, even after the US and China came to temporary agreements, right? Was it the result of a new bureaucratic arm of the Ministry of Commerce unable to process licenses quickly because this is a new regime, or were the delays deliberate? This is a classic misperception and uncertainty problem, right? Why were the extraterritorial clauses placed there by China? Was it to punish third countries or to signal something to the US? Very unclear. A higher likelihood of misperception, a higher likelihood of escalation. If we look at the risk aversion, right, this difficulty that multinational firms now have in trying to hire staff to relocate to China, right? So many multinational firms have seen not their, they're still there in China, but their physical footprint has shrunk. The number of people who are hired by that firm has shrunk. This means that even within a multinational firm, there is an erosion of a very important information and communication channel. Even within that multinational firm, the ties between the China office and the HQ, right, the richness of that information that used to flow has been substantially reduced. That makes it harder for that HQ to accurately assess what is happening in China. It makes it harder for that HQ then to communicate to its home government what its interests are vis-a-vis China. Again, that drives a higher likelihood of misperception, uncertainty, that raises the risks of unintended escalation. And then when we think about this resource misallocation, right, the tendency now towards excess capacity because of a national security logic. Again, ambiguity over what the strategic intent of China is, right? Is it to solve a domestic imbalance between demand and supply, or is there a hostile strategic intent to reshape global markets in China's own national interest, right? We've seen this play out in steel. We've seen this play out in electric vehicles. We've seen this play out in the Belt and Road Initiative. And I think we will see this play out again, especially because artificial intelligence and the leading edge innovations are so important in reshaping many different aspects of our lives. So it will drive greater misperception, uncertainty, and escalation. So let me now close off with some thoughts on what this means for players, third countries outside of the US and China, right? Given the US and China security dilemma, what does this mean for third countries, including Japan? I haven't talked as much about the global landscape, right? It isn't just being shaped by China, it's also being shaped by the United States. There is far more geopolitical instability here in the world today compared to previous decades. What this means for most third countries is that there is a search for insurance, right? There's a search for mutual insurance. But when we think about third countries in a more disaggregated way, right? Not all third countries are made the same. The options for different third countries will vary, right? And if we just think about two main axes, right? Firstly, the relative depth of ties with the US versus China, right? Is it more imbalanced towards the US, more imbalanced towards China, or fairly balanced? That will shape options, and the depth of the military relationship, of course, will shape the balance as well. So the options for Canada versus Japan are very different. The options for Vietnam versus Indonesia are very different. Canada and Japan versus Vietnam and Indonesia, again, another axis of difference if we think about military relationships. So what we see playing out is wide-ranging strategies, right? It's much more sophisticated analysis about third country strategies is needed, I think. On the one hand, we see a lot of countries engaging in diversification outside of both the US and China, right? So if you just look at Singapore, which is my home country, Singapore is actively strengthening ties with New Zealand and Australia. It's one of the founding countries driving the FIT partnership, right, to maintain the future of investment and trade in a rules-based, principled manner, right? And the discussions to strengthen ties between the EU and CPTPP as well, that kind of diversification. But we also see many countries trying to stabilize relationships directly with the US, right? Liberation Day tariff agreements, many examples of this, many examples of foreign states seeking to stabilize ties with China as well, right? To look for investment and trade opportunities, engage in renewed diplomacy with China where necessary and where possible. We see this happening in Europe. We see this happening with Canada as well. What does this mean, however? The search for stability, the search for diversification, the search for mutual insurance is complicated by this overarching US-China security dilemma that I laid out earlier. How so, right? When countries try to stabilize relationships with the US with these Liberation Day tariff agreements or Liberation Day tariff deals, what we see the US doing, especially in Southeast Asia, is including clauses that make it harder for the relationship with China, right? Clauses on transshipments, export control alignment, and so on. Similarly, in the search for greater stability with China, the Chinese legislation, this new counter-economic coercion toolkit, right, places firms potentially in a very difficult situation to be caught between conflicting legal obligations, right? The 2026 supply chain security regulations that just came out is one example, right? And both the US and China have made it not very clear when they will seek to enforce these clauses that will place firms in third countries in a very difficult situation. And of course, for China now, its domestic economy is still in a fairly weak position, right? And national security concerns, I think, continue to undermine its own vigorous efforts to try and strengthen the domestic economy. It's very hard to see in the near term China succeeding in its drive to enhance domestic demand as the main driver of growth. As long as high-tech industrial policy contains this national security imperative, we are likely to see continued trade frictions between China and these other third countries. And so what I want to conclude with in my final two slides is to reflect on a few points about trade diversification, right? Yes, it's very important, but will it work, right? I think given the complex networked nature of the international economy, even when third countries are diversifying their ties beyond the US and China, the security dilemma tensions are still going to spill over, right? The extraterritorial clauses make it such that it might spill over between Japan and another third country, right? With Vietnam, for example, especially if the strengthened ties are with connector countries. So the escalation risks, I think, remain quite high. Let me quickly conclude. So diversification is not enough, right? What then are some options? I think that economic diplomacy is important here. Are there strategies for Japan or other third countries to try to reduce these misperceptions that drive the security dilemma between the US and China? And if there were strategies, what might these options be? So let me just lay some out. I'm not saying that any of these options are easy, but to just put them on the table, right? In terms of economic diplomacy with China, I think a lot of work could be done on credibility, right? What are the options to communicate to China the need to improve the credibility of its assurances? China could do this by sharing more information and giving more disclosure in its export licensing regime and decision-making logic, right? China could adopt more credible constraints on the use of its counter-coercion economic toolkit. the existing legislative language gives it very broad ambit to act as and when it sees fit. And for China to understand that the security logic has this chilling effect for many firms, right? This risk aversion that makes it harder for foreign firms to do business in China. And for China to demonstrate that benefit to itself is not necessarily gained through the imposition of economic harm on others. Here, I think that China does recognize the possibility of this logic in the sense of managed trade, price controls, curbs on involution as well. But of course, we can't expect China to take any of these actions voluntarily or unilaterally. The security dilemma necessarily means that both the US and China need to engage in a give and take, right? So what would the US need to offer in return? But nevertheless, I think that communication on the need to strengthen credibility in economic security, improve restraint, right, to reduce the risks of unintended conflict and unintended misperception is very important. So with that, let me close. I apologize for going a few minutes over time. But please, if any of you have comments or questions, even after this seminar, this is my email. I very much welcome feedback and your comments and criticisms on my analysis so far. This is very much ongoing and evolving thinking on my part. So let me thank you very much, and I'll stop sharing my slides.